All right, let's get started. Hello and welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for joining us for such a pertinent topic at an even more critical time. My name is Natasha Dinham. I am the Senior Project Manager for Innovative Finance at the Bertha Center for Social Innovation and Entrepreneurship. At the Bertha Center, we have been building the impact investing market for almost a decade. And I can honestly say that there has never been a more critical need for impact investing than there is right now. Today, we're very proud to be hosting a range of experts who will be sharing their experience of impact investing as it relates to the global pandemic. One of our favorite parts of hosting events usually is to engage with you as the audience and get your insights. Obviously, that is a little bit more difficult today as we're virtual, but we have allocated time for a live Q&A at the end of the webinar. So we encourage you to please put your questions into the Q&A box below, and we'll be addressing those at the end of the session. Right now, I'd like to hand over to one of Impact Investing South Africa's key members and a good friend of the Bertha Center, and also a social change champion in his own right. Sipo, let me hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Natasha, and welcome everybody who's on this webinar. It really is very pleasing to see. I see we have just over 150 people who have joined already. Maybe just to give you a little bit of background, I, as Natasha has indicated, am a member of the National Advisory Board and the Task Force on Social Impact Investing in South Africa. And this is an initiative that started a couple of years ago now, and has been looking at how we create an environment, but also just establish a proper ecosystem in South Africa around impact investing. And through our efforts, in fact, we sort of become a continental effort because we see now National Advisory Board get established in other parts of the continent. Since establishment, there have been a number of things that are really important, I think, that the task force has accomplished, including the fact that this year, if it was not for COVID-19, we were going to be hosting this GSG, the Global Steering Group. In other words, that's a global conference which was hosted in Buenos Aires last year, where we bring together all the key stakeholders, including policymakers, investors, and people on the demand side, in a discussion around how we continue to progress impact investing for the benefit of a lot of people, which, as Natasha has indicated, what COVID-19 has done is to elevate the need for people to work together, particularly to fundamentally address the issues of inequality, unemployment, and poverty, which we see play out, in front of our eyes, especially now with COVID-19. And one of the things that we've been doing is to see how we can work, particularly with government, to create the policy space and legislation and regulations, which is going to create the necessary environment to attract, a significant amount of investment into social impact investment. So we've been working with the DTI as well as National Treasury and SARS to look at what needs to be done in this country from a policy, legislation, or regulatory standpoint. And it would be quite interesting to listen to Nick Hurd in terms of what his experiences have been, especially given the UK's experience of how they've managed to expand social impact investing quite significantly. But in addition to that, we have task forces or working groups, one focusing on the supply side, in other words, the pools of funds that are available to invest in impact investing. And on the other side, the demand side. And obviously we know that measurement of impact is quite important, and therefore there are intermediaries that have to play a very important role in that space. So all of this work has been really, very important because, it placed South Africa in a very good position not only as a host for the GSG summit, but also to drive impact investing in this country. And maybe just looking and talking about COVID-19 and picking up from the initial comments from Natasha. I mean, we see what's happening with unemployment. We see the huge impact that the nationwide lockdowns are having, particularly on small and medium enterprises. We see unemployment increasing, but we see the most vulnerable of our society who are hugely impacted. Obviously, COVID-19 is going to be with us, and I see WHO is now saying it may be an endemic. In other words, we may learn to live with COVID-19 just like we've learned to live with HIV and AIDS, in our societies and so on. But what this presents is an opportunity for people, investors, governments, institutions, to revisit what they're doing, what they've been doing up to now, and to chart a new path in terms of the future. Because what COVID-19 also presents are major opportunities. If you just look at our country, I think we stand in a very good opportunity as a country for particularly government to fundamentally address some of those things that they haven't addressed up to now. There may be policy, there may be reforms, there may be how we look at the structure of our economy, but also how we bridge the divides between the haves and the have-nots. And this presents major opportunities in a number of areas, whether it's healthcare or education or agriculture or the network, areas such as water, transportation, telecoms, and so on. So there are major opportunities that are emerging, especially in an environment where, in our country, the spirit of partnerships, of collaboration between government, the private sector, philanthropies, and civil society has increased. It presents major opportunities for us to really expand our efforts in growing social impact investing for the greater good, and with a lot of alignment with the SDG goals on the other hand. So thanks very much for joining. It really is a pleasure for you to be here, and it's really, really pleasing to see the numbers continue to increase of people that are participating in this webinar. Thank you, and I'm going to hand over back to you, Natasha.
Thanks so much, Cesar. And now for our keynote, I'd like to hand over to Nick Hurd. Nick was one of the longest serving ministers, UK ministers for civil society, and led the work that established the UK as one of the leaders in developing impact investing markets. Nick, it's wonderful to have you here. Thank you.
Natasha, thank you. And greetings and friendship from the UK. I'm full of congratulations for you on the progress that you've made in 10 years on the impact journey, and as well as wanting to wish everyone on this webinar continued sort of good health and well-being. I wish you all success and strength on the thinking and the decisions that are going to have to be taken in the next few months as we all think through our response to this seismic shock. And you've asked me to talk about COVID as a catalyst. How can we come back stronger? And of course, that's the right question, because a shock of this size is going to lead to change, and it's got to lead to the right change. And we have to make and win those arguments. And I look at this through the lens of a politician who spent the last 8 or 9 years serving my country as a government minister, including almost 5 years leading the work to develop our ecosystem to support social in investment. And what drove me and my colleagues during that time was a very strong belief that we would make so much more progress as a country in the face of the kind of stubborn structural challenges that we've got, if we could really forge a much more effective partnership between government, the private sector, and our social sector, our social economy, our civil society, if we could harness all those assets and get those different parts of society pulling together, we would make so much more progress. That's really what drove me. And that's, I think, really relevant to the situation that we're in now. And now I've stepped out of politics. I'm committing myself again to the impact movement and chairing in the UK the Access Foundation, which is our social investment wholesaler that is exploring the role of blended finance in terms of impact investment, as well as supporting Sir Ronnie Cohen and many others in the GSG network, a learning network for 30 countries around the world, including, I'm delighted to say, South Africa, to learn together as we kind of break this difficult ground and change mindsets in the way that we want. So when I look at this crisis, like you, of course, I see tragedy, but I also see an opportunity. And I've been very struck with my conversations with different countries in the GSG network. Some of the frustration that I've heard in that network about the difficulties of engaging with government, of getting government to understand what we're talking about, or engaging with the things that we're asking for. But now we're in a situation where governments need help. I would argue that even before COVID, governments were around the world. You look at Chile, you look at other countries where the public are very publicly expressing their discontent with government. Now we're in a situation where governments around the world are looking at a public health crisis that is turning into an economic crisis, that in some parts of the world will turn into a humanitarian crisis. As we've heard, part of the tragedy of this terrible virus is that its effect is falling disproportionately on the most vulnerable. And in every country, not least my own in the UK, it is exposing weaknesses in our systems that were already there and which we should have tackled. Economic weaknesses, weaknesses in our health systems, weaknesses in our social systems. For example, in my country, the UK, is exposing the levels of unacceptable food insecurity. But every country is now having a very harsh spotlight thrown on their weaknesses and their vulnerabilities. And as the public move through the emotional stages of this crisis, and as more and more people lose their jobs and their income, the public will demand a response that leaves them more reassured than they are now that this will not happen again, that their country will be more resilient, will be better prepared. So this pressure is building and sucking cash, sucking political bandwidth at a time, as we all know, that in the background we have huge global crises that are interconnected and coming to head. Climate change, devastating loss of our natural ecosystems, so important to hundreds of millions of people in Africa, and interconnected as they are to the huge challenge of meeting the SDGs. So this is the political context. Who would be a political leader at this moment? And they may not know it, but they need help. And this feels to me, as I think Natasha was suggesting, like a really decisive moment for the impact investment movement. Because if we can't prove and demonstrate our relevance now, when will we ever? You know, this has to be a moment for us as a movement that sees ourselves as a provider of and supporter of better solutions, more important than ever, surely now, for us to prove our relevance, engage with government in an effective way. But how? And of course, one of the difficulties and challenges of this crisis is that every country starts and is in a different place in terms of the state of the economy, state of the health systems, state of the public finances, the weight of the formal versus the informal economy. We're all in different stages on this journey, but there are common themes that governments across the globe are going to have to face. Rising and high unemployment, huge deterioration in public finances and increases in debt, the highlighting of the kind of structural problems that I talked about before. And I think very, very seriously the risk of rising inequality from a base where levels of inequality were already rising, and for many of us already completely unacceptable. The recovery which will come from this terrible virus carries with it a huge risk of rising inequality. So in the GSG network, as we look at this, we see three phases, as many of you do. They're obvious ones to some degree, but it's a helpful framework for looking at the question of COVID as a catalyst and how we can come back stronger. So the first phase is clearly emergency, where most countries are at the moment, including the UK, and there clearly the priority is to save lives and save organisations that are critical to the fabric of the country. And we talk about this a lot, because we're always asking ourselves the question, where can we help? Where can we make a contribution? Where can we help be part of the solution? And our instinct is that our value is likely to be most important in the recovery and the renewal phases. But that's not to say we're not pushing ourselves very hard to think about what can we offer in the emergency phase. So obviously for most countries, looking beyond the containment and lockdown phase, the availability of reliable, quick, flexible testing and the ability to manufacture that testing capacity at scale is critical. So my friend and colleague Ronnie Cohen is going around the world proposing to governments innovation bonds that would help bring in private capital to incentivize companies to ramp up their innovation and their production capacity, which they might not otherwise be incentivized to do, and to introduce a payment by results using existing tools such as advanced market commitments that were used in the Ebola crisis. So that's just one strand of our engagement with governments, again, trying to focus on a critical issue for the governments of the day and trying to present them with a smarter response to securing the objectives they require. That's a big grand scheme. In the UK, we're also looking at the opportunity to drill down into practical social problems where we could be, again, part of the solution. So we face an extraordinary situation in the UK where we've had a long problem with homelessness and street sleepers. Shameful, and governments over many years have failed to make progress on a difficult subject. We now, as a result of COVID, have an extraordinary situation where all the rough sleepers in the country have been taken off the street and are in hotels and bed and breakfasts at taxpayers' expense. And so we know who they are and where they are. And this feels like an historic opportunity to provide them with the accommodation they need and, critically, the wraparound support that they need. And so as a movement, we're working together to try and bring a proposal to the government about how we can mobilize impact investment to help with that and perhaps create an unexpected positive dividend from COVID, which is to end rough sleeping in the UK through an impact solution. But I think in the short term, critically for us, and I come back to, this is a stage where we're prioritizing saving lives and saving organizations. I don't know what the reality is in South Africa is, but in the UK, our social economy, our social enterprises, our NGOs are facing an existential crisis. They feel enormously vulnerable. And so, again, we are engaging with government around the design of the kind of support package that the sector needs. And they're obviously critical to our movement because they are often the providers of the solutions that we want to introduce and back. And they face a very vulnerable situation at the moment. So, and I'm sure that's the same in countries around the world. For the impact movement, a priority must be to look at the kind of stimulus packages that the governments are producing around the world, including, I know, in South Africa, and engaging with the government to make sure that it's reaching the parts of the economy that we can't afford to lose, because you know how hard it is to build up an effective social organization and how hard it is to recreate that. And part of our mission is to inform and educate and work with government to try and make sure that these stimulus packages don't just flow into the largest organizations or the organizations that the banks already have relationships with, but that we push ourselves hard to make sure that it reaches the organizations that we really can't afford to lose. So we've been influential in the UK of influencing a multi-million-pound resilience package specifically for charities and social enterprises. And we're happy to share that experience. When I look at the recovery phase, when we as the GSG movement look at recovery, it's interesting drawing together the threads of conversations with 30 different countries about what we feel might emerge as important opportunities for the impact movement to add value, be part of the solution for governments. They tend to focus around healthcare systems, education, and the really critical issue about the creation of jobs or the support for people in the transition to new jobs and new training opportunities and new skill development opportunities, because these, of course, will be huge drains on the public purse. And it would be extraordinary to me if governments weren't interested in thinking about how the private sector capacity could be mobilized to help. So in health, again, I don't know what the situation is in South Africa, but in the UK, we're deeply concerned about the level of deaths that are occurring that are not related to COVID, but relate to other chronic conditions or people with cancer or cardiovascular issues that are not going to hospital. Or if we have a second spike, our NHS will be, the capacity will be focused on COVID. So huge pressure on our health system. And the question around for us is how can we help our health system in terms of helping those non-COVID patients with access to treatment and care. Education, again, we're in this extraordinary situation. I've taken a break from homeschooling my children to speak with you this afternoon, but we have, children out of school around the world. There'll be parts of the world, or regions within countries where actually it's going to be quite difficult to get them back into school. We already have in many middle and low income countries, I can use that expression, relatively high dropout rate. So that pre-COVID. So what does this mean post-COVID in terms of our ability to deliver that most critical social service, the education of our children, and the role of technology and medium that we haven't used before to try and connect the educator and the children. And surely there must be space and role for the impact movement to be part of the solution to that challenge. And as I mentioned before this, I think the biggest pressing political issue for politicians as we move from the public health crisis will be jobs, and it will be incomes. And there again, part of our conversation with the British government is going to be, at the right time, how do we make sure that we do not widen inequality in this process, because our existing level of inequality is unacceptable. And we know from the past that when the tide rises, as we all hope it will, there will be places and there will be people at risk of being left behind, because they always are. And this time round, we have to be sure, surely, that our recovery strategy takes that additional effort and that additional resource to make sure that people are not left behind this time. In the UK, we call it a levelling up agenda that our Prime Minister talks about. But the government will find this hard because the money tends to flow where it always does flow. It tends to flow where the big businesses are. But our social enterprise movement in the UK has a very good track record in terms of delivering jobs and economic opportunity for difficult places and difficult people. And we are determined to make that argument again. And when I look at and I'll close on this, the sort of renewal phase. Here in the UK, we talk a lot about resilience now, and that's clearly a key buzzword. But we're also talking about building back better. And what does that mean? It means taking a good, hard, honest look at our economic model, and this is the same around the world, and recognizing that actually there were two big structural fault lines in that model. The first is that it simply didn't work well enough for enough people. Too many people left behind, unacceptable inequality, as I've talked about. So why would we want to build back a model that was deficient in that way? And the second critical fault line in our previous economic model is surely the absolutely unacceptable risk that it takes with the environmental ecosystems on which we as humans depend. And as I said, the existential risks associated with climate change, loss of biodiversity, loss of our natural resources is now something that we have to address. And so we talk about Build Back Better, and there are lots of people and lots of organizations that share those values and are aligned. But and in the impact movement, of course, we have the vision that Ronnie Cohen and others is evangelical about, in terms of a future in which, you know, private sector and business plays a much more proactive and positive role in terms of providing solutions to social problems rather than helping to cause them. A future in which businesses measure their impact, are much more transparent about their impact. A future in which investors, the owners of assets, have much better information about what their money is doing and are much more motivated to invest for impacts. We have a campaign developing in the UK, which I'm helping to advise, called Make My Money Matter. And our aim is to target the UK pension funds and to connect the British public with their power to direct savings towards investments and assets and companies that have a more positive, deliberate impact on society. And there are many of us who sort of share that vision, but I'll close with this word of caution. And I speak as a sort of politician that spent 14 years representing people and sitting around the table of decision-making in government. We should not underestimate the default setting here. In a shock like this, profound as it is, because no country, I think, can claim with real credibility they were genuinely ready for it, and we're still at the early stages of its certainly economic impact. The human response is very likely to prioritize trying to get back what we had before. People will want their old jobs back. Politicians will be looking for growth wherever and jobs wherever they can find them. There'll be pressure to do things quickly, which may jar with the hopes that I think we probably all have on this call, that this COVID is we can use COVID as a catalyst, an opportunity to shape a better world and shape a better economic model. But there will be a default setting of trying to help people get back to what they had before and get back to what is described as normal. And therefore we should not take anything for granted in terms of the need to make an argument and build an argument with evidence, not just in terms of data, but evidence of organizations and people and investment that is actually prepared to roll its sleeves up and be part of the solution. And therefore we must pass the test of relevance in all these phases, emergency, recovery, in order to have the chance to win the arguments about the kind of renewal and the opportunity to come back stronger, as you've asked me to talk about. And in that process, we must learn together, we must lean together, we must pull together. And that is exactly why the GSG, the Global Steering Group, exists, to connect countries, to help countries learn from each other, from success and failure, and to be inspired by each other on this journey to make sure that the change that comes from this COVID crisis, because change will come, is the right change. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Nick. And such a salient point you made, that if we as the impact investing ecosystem, whether we're private sector or public sector, can't show our relevance now, then when will we ever? And I think we're very lucky today to be joined by a number of organizations who are stepping up to the party and using impact investing strategies to really address not only the emergency response to COVID-19, but the long-term recovery and resilience that will come post-COVID-19. So I will now hand over to Tanya van Lill, who is the CEO of SAVCA, who will be leading a panel that I'm really excited to hear about with a number of local homegrown change makers who are getting their hands dirty.
Thank you, Tash, and afternoon, everyone, and specifically to my esteemed panelists, if I can ask them to switch their videos on and to join us. And while they do that, I just want to give you some context to what the conversation will be about for the panelists this afternoon, is we really want to look at the relevance of public and private sector collaboration, specifically in the response, the emergency and recovery response to COVID-19, with emphasis on the financing and the investment that has been made available. We also want to look at the opportunities for private investors in the recovery phase. And I like what Nick said in terms of the third phase, which is the renewal phase, which I don't think we've really been thinking about here in South Africa. I think we're still so in the emergency and recovery phases. And then the last thing is to highlight the catalytic capital from public and private sector that is needed to leverage large-scale investments. But before we go there, and before I ask my panelists to introduce themselves, I just want us to briefly think about the evolution of the spectrum of capital that has been available, from pure financial returns, where the focus has been on competitive financial returns, to responsible and sustainable investing, where the aim was to do no harm, to impact investing, where it is about creating high impact solutions, social and environmental impact solutions, not necessarily foregoing financial returns, to philanthropy. But in the crisis that we find ourselves in, we see there are numerous vulnerabilities that have been illuminated and have been highlighted, not only from a health perspective, but more so from an economic and social perspective. And the public and private sector has a major role to play in the time that we find ourselves in. And I think more so than ever, we see the importance of the SDGs. So I'd like to, with that backdrop, ask our panelists to introduce themselves, just who they are, what they do, and particularly with this topic, any projects that they are involved with. Miriam, can I start with you?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll speak to some of the projects that are relevant. I'll just be very quick. I'm Miriam Altman, National Planning Commissioner, professor at UJ, have my own strategy consultancy company, in summary.
Great, thank you, Miriam. Sibo, over to you, if you can please introduce yourself.
Thanks, Tanya. I'm Sibonakaliso Mavuka, I'm manager at Tshikululu Social Investments. So we manage a number of foundations and trusts on behalf of corporate clients. And we've been lucky in the sense that we've been involved in every single impact bond in South Africa that has been launched, as well as other schemes like guarantee schemes to open up further financing for things like education. So we've been involved in impact investing both from the implementation side as well as from the IMM side as well, providing that as a service to impact investors throughout South Africa.
Thank you. Hamilton.
Hello, yes. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes, so I'm Hamilton Ndlovu. I'm a senior relationship executive at ABSA Corporate and Investment Banking, social bond and financial by people. And we are working with me and our clients to survive in this time of crisis.
Great, thank you, Hamilton. I think I got the gist of it, and I will incorporate it into my question and answers that or questions that I'll ask. I think what we'll do is we'll start off with a few questions that I would like to ask our panel, and then I'm going to ask you, our attendees, if you've got any questions that you would like to pose to the panelists. There is the Q&A function that you'll see at the bottom of your screen. Please use that function if you have any specific questions you want to raise to the panelists in general or to a specific panel member. Miriam, can I start with you? Can you tell us more about the task force that you're involved with and some of the initiatives in that particular task force?
Yeah, sure. And I realize I've made a terrible error, given that you're GSB, because I'm an adjunct professor at Mandela School of Public Governance. So I'm going to be in big trouble if I don't say that. So we, before the lockdown, a group of us got together, which I convened, and we're called COVID-19 Economist Group because we couldn't think of a better name. And what we do is we're a bunch of policy economists and financial economists focused on creating solutions for working very closely with the Treasury Presidency. But I wanted to say that we've also posted our stuff and share other work as well on a website. I'll put it in the message box. But it's at covid19economicideas.org, but I will put it in the chat box. And it's UCT, it's UJ, it's Stellenbosch, it's a range of institutions. So thus far, the main work that we've done is to look at a macro fiscal strategy, to look at monetary strategy, wage support proposals and bridging finance, because we think actually, in fact, since we have Nick here, we think that the UK approach, which offers more blanket support, is something that you need to do when you shut all business down, and particularly when you have businesses that are in a fragile situation. What will be coming out shortly is a paper on employment scenarios and critical economic strategy. And actually, we're going to be producing a paper on a COVID social impact bond. So I'm going to speak to that in this session, hopefully.
Miriam, where's the biggest funding gaps that you've seen based on the work that you've done, based on the relief that is already available? Are there still some glaring gaps?
Well, there's definitely. Our original problem in the country wasn't so much that there isn't money, but it's more about prioritization and improving productivity. The situation now, one of the members of our group is Intellidex, Stuart Theobald, who many of the people who are here probably know. They've been doing the macro modeling for our group, and amongst other things, they show that if GDP falls by 15%, and actually my worst scenario right now has GDP falling by 20%, and I think it could actually be worse. But say GDP falls by 15%, the revenue shortfall by our calculation would be about 340 billion. And after basic market funding, the gap would be about 305 billion in this financial year. And over the course of the next 2 years, it would be about another 200 billion. After we go to the IMF stroke NDB stroke AFDB, we're probably, that 100 billion odd that Treasury's been talking about, we end up around 200 billion. So where do we get the rest? Either we cut the budget by 200 billion, or we go back to the IMF. So our proposal is for a public sector social impact bond, which I could talk about now if you like.
Yes, please.
Can I? Okay. So this is not on our website yet. I should just say that all of the work we do, we've been working behind the scenes since the middle of March, actually, with the powers that be. And this particular bond we've been talking to Treasury about with assets and liabilities since for about probably more than the past month. And that's how we've been doing all our work. So our work, by the time it gets to the website, has already been through that process. It's not the start of a process, just to say. So these aren't just random proposals. These are things that have been developed with, the DG of Treasury and so on. It doesn't mean that they're doing it yet, but that's where it is. So anyway, so our idea is that we could have almost like a sovereign 100 billion Rand COVID social impact bond that would leverage ESG. So to your question of public and private coming together. So Intellidex did a survey in the last quarter of 2019 of 29 large pension funds, and 76% of them said that increasing sustainability or ESG in their portfolio was extremely important over the coming 12 months. And I don't know that that would have changed. And I'm speaking about South Africa now. Now the concept is that it would be government issued, and if so, it would be the second sovereign to do this. The first one was Ecuador. It would be paid into the General Revenue Fund, but earmarked to specifics, of course, like health, speaking to your SDG requirements, PPE, equipment, quarantine costs, staffing, infrastructure, or decent work, funding a wage bridge or a business bridge that makes sure that fewer firms fail or shrink, that type of thing. And maybe sustainable cities, given the location of where COVID tends to be. It would be spent through normal procurement channels. It would be raised through your standard DMTC Eurobond frameworks that are generally used for issuance by government, but with the prospectus supplements to accommodate a social bond principles, coupon, and governance frameworks. The thought is the coupon, it would be floating linked to the repo. So very, very low cost, even lower cost than what the IMF would charge. If you meet social objectives, and if you don't meet these social objectives, then of course it reverts to what it would normally cost. If it were in US dollars, it would be LIBOR plus 385 basis points, and the term would be about 5 years. That's what we're putting together. I'm going into a little bit more detail because I think that the community would be interested in that kind of detail. What the shape of that would be. Now, would it be exactly like this? Would it even happen? I don't know. I think Treasury is going to need this. We've been testing the market. We've had a very good response to it. Is 100 billion crazy? Well, the response so far has been not. I mean, that was my question initially when the idea was floated. Seems not. Seems that there's appetite. It might be half rand, half dollar. We have pro bono, Tumamina help from in terms of legal, book building, support, etc. We're waiting for a green light from Treasury to say we need this. That's where it is. Working with assets and liabilities and crossing the T's and dotting the I's. This can go out the door now if they say they want to do it.
Miriam, thank you so much for sharing. I'm sure that there's going to be questions about it from our audience wanting more information, wanting more detail. Hamilton, I'm going to come to you and I want to talk a little bit about ABSA. And you've implemented a range of options for supporting customers during this time. Tell us more about what you've implemented and how it's contributed to the overall impact and relief efforts.
Okay, sure. So I think across all the banks, we've implemented this bond repayment holiday. And just to dwell on that, I think it's more of a way of putting money back into the people. I mean, if you look at what's happening to especially SMEs and small to medium term businesses, they function on having to obviously sell. It's all about supply and demand. And right now they're unable to. So basically bond repayment holidays give our clients access to help their underlying staff members to actually live and buy essential goods wherever they can. It's about access to liquidity. It's about reducing defaults, increasing your working capital, or just preserving what you currently have in the market, because business is not booming, GDP is dropping at the moment, and these guys are unable to pay their fixed costs. I'm not even mentioning their variable costs. And to go into the bigger scheme, we have the Solidarity Fund that we are administering. And if you think about that, there was, I think, 2 billion in those funds which were oversubscribed. And the oversubscription just tells you what's happening in the current environment and the current market, that people are struggling. People really do not have access to funds. And as banks or financial institutions, we're trying to find means and ways to put some of the cash we have into the hands of our clients. I mean, if you look at the criteria of applying for these loans, you need to have had a business for 24 months. Some of them are non-interest, or the interest has been reduced. It differs according to each business. But I think what the financial institutions are trying to do per se is saying, look, we don't know how long this crisis will last. the socioeconomic impact is major. And what we can do for the short term is provide you with access to liquidity, for you to be able to survive. We're not even talking about growing. We're talking about surviving, being able to pay your staff members, fixed costs, variable costs. And right now it's working. But the longer the freeze goes or the lockdown goes, and the longer the GDP, shrinks, the more financial institutions and the government has to do.
Okay. But Hamilton, in terms of the SA Future Trust Fund, I mean, we've launched an initiative where some of our members have donated hours and expertise in the form of strategy consulting, legal consulting, etc., to SMMEs. But how's the trust adding value to the SMMEs? Because it seems like there's a funding need, but also what do you do with the funding once you receive it?
So I guess there's a bit of a gap there, right? We work in silos. We're doing this work from home. So we are creative. We've got platforms where we're trying to be more innovative, opposed to we know we're just funding clients, but at the end of the day, how can we actually help them manage their businesses? And we have implemented strategies and groups to help deal with that. Right now, the main focus is, okay, let's fund them. They're coming to the bank and saying, look, can I have a payment holiday? I need X amount of funding. I need to be able to pay my bills. I need to be able to sustain a living for the next 3 months. We're putting together models. And on top of that, we've realized that just giving them funding without the know-how doesn't really assist to the point where it starts creating, benefits for the client. So we have put together strategies and groups to start thinking about, okay, we've created these pools of funding. Okay, we can assist X amount of clients. With that assistance, what else can we do to actually help them sustain economic growth going forward?
I've asked this question to Miriam as well, but where do you see the current funding gaps in terms of the kinds of applications that you are receiving?
So the funding gaps are clear to see. If you look at corporates or organizations that have fully fledged legal departments, those guys are easily have access to funding because they have all the paperwork. If you look at the smaller SMEs, they are struggling to find the means and the channels to access this capital. An SME that's has a turnover of less than 25 million. If they do not have a legal department that has all the T's and C's and dots connected, they're going to struggle to get the funding because there's stringent outlines and stringent processes and regulations and metrics that are required to get this funding. So that's where I see some of the gaps, as in your larger corporates will have all their ducks in a row, whereas the smaller SMEs will struggle to find ways to get to the front of the line to access that funding.
Great, thank you, Hamilton. I want to move over to Sibonakaliso. Sibo, in terms of Tshikululu, you're supporting the Solidarity Fund. Tell us a little bit more about the support and the initiatives from that perspective.
So thank you, Tanya. In terms of the Solidarity Fund, it's Tshikululu and a number of other organizations that are involved, from your financial institutions to legal companies, as well as your trust management. So in Tshikululu's side, we manage basically the due diligence side for the organizations that receive funding from the Solidarity Fund, as well as a strategy around the food relief program that we always hear about. So the food parcels that you hear Solidarity Fund currently giving out to people, as well as organizations, so finding organizations, because Tshikululu has been around for 22 years, working with organizations that are on the ground, working in communities. We are the guys who also find those organizations as well to support the food relief program. So that's one of the things, as well as the monitoring and evaluation side. Obviously, we're receiving people's money in the Solidarity Fund, so we have to be able to report and account for that money or those donations that are there. So the monitoring and evaluation, as well as the data collection that is coming through from these organizations that are implementing on behalf. I think the last time I checked the numbers, we were sitting at about 250,000 food parcels that have been distributed throughout South Africa in the various communities in order for food relief initiatives.
These are great examples of collaboration and how investors are working together. I wanted to ask you, in terms of the resources needed for catalytic capital, so do you have an idea of the quantum, or considering the scale, how should we use or harness or address these big problems, and where's the money going to come from?
So in terms of catalytic capital, I think the main place where you'd find them is in empowerment endowments. So empowerment endowments are your BE trusts that usually own shares in big corporates for BE points purposes, as well as your foundations, which is the 1% net profit after tax in South Africa, aligned to the BE scorecard. So the last I checked, I think it was CSI money or 1% net profit after tax was in excess of 9 billion rand in South Africa that is spent per year. As well as from the empowerment endowment side, I think the size was above 36 billion rand, but I don't know, with COVID-19 and hammering the markets, it might have gone down, because these are linked to the share prices of big corporates in South Africa. So those are the areas where we could, just to give an example of one of the projects that we've actually worked in, where Catalytic Capital has actually worked to provide even larger funding from the commercial banks as well. So we run a program where we fund medical doctors. We will run it to one of South Africa's large medical schools. So we put through our client discovery about 20 million rand into a guarantee scheme to fund students who can't get onto NSFAS, don't have bursaries, so what we call the missing middle students. And we were able, with one of the big banks, to actually unlock 200 million rand. So it was 1 to 10, so 200 million rand to go towards the funding of medical students. So the guarantee fund, obviously, if the student goes and works, they'll pay back the loan. If they don't pay back the loan, the guarantee fund would step in and actually pay back the loan on their behalf. But obviously, all the mechanisms to get the money back are still in place that the bank would use. So that's an example, for instance, where you've been through 20 million rand, because anyway, a donation from a foundation, for instance, or a public benefit organization, would be 100% financial loss. Yes, there's impact that we gain from it, but when you give out a grant, that's 100% financial loss. So why not use the loss, that financial loss, to actually preserve it and make interest over time while you're waiting for those medical students to default. And I think the repayment rate is around 98%. In terms of that guarantee scheme. So they've only called on about 2% of that money, which is probably covered by the interest rate that we receive anyway, where it's sitting right now. So that's one example. But we've also seen blended finance or catalytic funding coming in. For instance, we heard Miriam speaking about impact bonds. So those are new things in South Africa. It's not a standard template. There's no standard template on how to set up one of these things. So what would happen is that there's a lot of setup costs that come up in the beginning. So legal fees, getting the lawyers to come in and structure things, getting banks or getting financial institutions or financial advisors to come in, or the rating as well. So you'd find, I know one of our clients and one of the impact bonds that were launched in South Africa put in about 2 million rand in order to cover those kind of fees, because nobody wanted to come in and step in and actually pay for that. So that's one of the ways in which catalytic funding, again, a donation is 100% financial loss. So whether it's, whether you pay it out as a grant or as an impact bond, as an outcomes funder, but that is 100% financial loss that you'll be getting. So there are ways in which catalytic capital can actually unlock much more funding. Without that initial seed funding of 2 million rand, you wouldn't have been able to structure this bond, which means you wouldn't have been able to crowd in the commercial funding that's there.
Well, these are all great examples. How do we get the word out more? Because I think one of the things we don't always do is there's so much happening, we don't realize all the great initiatives that are going on. So how do we encourage more people to take on projects like these?
So I think that the main way is probably around skills development, like teaching people. I know we've got organizations like the Bertha Center and the ecosystem building part. We know that in South Africa, we've got the task force, which Cesar alluded to in the beginning, where we come together and find ways in which we spread the word and how does impact investing grow in South Africa? How do foundations actually step in and do their work or their part in trying to grow the sector? Because there's no way in trying to meet this 2030 SDG targets that have been placed, there's no way to do it with just grant funding alone. That pool of funding is small, whereas the financial sector is sitting on the trillions of rands in South Africa. And also, one of the biggest things I think that we found in the commercial sector is around when you meet with people, and this has changed over time with impact investing coming to the forefront amongst investors. When you meet with people, as soon as you mention impact or social, the first thing that comes to mind is that you're going to be losing money in this. So this should be left to grant funders. It's not their thing. It should be CSI people who do it. And increasingly, we've seen people coming in, and mainly through organizations that have been able to, and I saw one of the empowerment endowments here who actually were the leaders when it comes to blended finance, which Nick spoke to in one of the impact bonds, where at first one of the big insurance companies thought this thing is too risky for them, but they were able to step in as your more concessionary funding, and were able to then unlock the capital, make it more palatable for the insurance company to come in with much bigger ticket sizes, obviously. So it's around education and just getting the word out there, whether through marketing and writing briefs or papers around this. So which is one thing we're trying to do at Tshikululu, as well as working with the other ecosystem builders that we sit with in the different forums.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Sibo. I'm now going to ask the audience to please submit any questions they have. There's a few questions that came through for Nick. He unfortunately had to drop off the Zoom call, but he has committed to providing responses via email. So we do have your questions, and we'll send it to him via email and share it with you post the session. Miriam, I see there's a lot of interest that have come in for your social bond proposal. One of the questions asks that, given the poor real returns that pension funds have achieved in the past 5 years, how could pension fund trustees meet their fiduciary's responsibilities by investing in such a social bond with a coupon linked to the repo? There's no term premium given that will be below real return and below that equivalent government bond yield currently. So what is the sense there in terms of the appetite for pension funds in terms of real returns?
I've got a very bad internet connection. I heard sort of every other word, but I think what you're asking is it realistic to think that anyone's going to put money into something that just earns them the repo rate?
That's about it, and it's specifically pension funds.
Well, you know, well, it's not necessarily just pension funds, by the way. I was just giving a statistic that said that there could be interest because of course the pension funds are important. You know, in this environment, you know, frankly, we're losing money now. So this was a question that I had asked as well. Any question that anyone can throw, I probably was the worst critic of the idea. Not that I don't love the idea, but I myself asked these questions. You know, you got to try is the first thing. It's pretty secure because it's sovereign. So, you know, so the return, the issue for many corporates and for pension funds is that they still feel that they need to achieve their ESG commitments, and that was important to them. This is a very tiny, although it sounds like a lot of money, it's a very tiny proportion of total investment. So it's not going to break the bank. It's at least secure, or at least your capital will be secure. I think that was the thinking. And then nothing ventured, nothing gained. You know, the issue is to try.
Another question came through for the entire panel, so anyone can address this question. It spoke about the SA policy and implementation environment over the last 10 years has generally been hostile towards public-private projects or partnerships. Given the current crisis, do you believe the government will review policies and a recommitment of government to real impact partnerships at scale with private sector? And why do you think so?
Sorry, so I can speak on the public benefits organization side of things and the catalytic funders. That's one of the biggest issues that we found around participating in impact investing, because there's strict rules around the taxation and what you can and cannot do as a public benefits organization. So most of our clients are either Section 30 or Section 18A PBOs, which means you can't get involved in the investment side of things, but probably as an outcomes fund on impact bond, as well as a guarantee scheme on the skills development, because that would fall under providing bursaries to students. So that has been a problem, and it's become quite expensive for us to set up such structures or use such instruments, because the legal opinions that we have to get, I think the first impact bond that we got involved with one of our clients, we spent around 120,000 Rand just getting legal opinions from a number of legal firms, because we didn't know how we could do this. We knew there's a social benefit to it, which is what a public benefit organization is there for, but we didn't know how to get it. And I think through our engagements, through the task force and the working committees that Caesar spoke about, this is one of the things that we're trying to lobby government to actually change. I think one of the task force's subcommittees is around foundations and how foundations can play an increasing role within the impact investing space. So we'll look and see the lessons that we're probably going to learn through the COVID-19 virus, and how, or the COVID-19 pandemic, and how foundations can play a much stronger role outside of just providing grants, maybe in the impact investing space.
Hamilton, from an ABSA Bank perspective, have you been involved in any public-private partnerships, and do you foresee a change in that going forward given the current crisis?
You know, like it's difficult to tell how the government is going to react, but like just coming on to CBC, when it comes to bond issuances, it is pretty expensive in the market, and maybe it's a time that the government looks at the regs again and tries to look at how they can influence and help the smaller SMEs. I mean, one of the ways to reduce the costing is to not have it rated, right? But the moment you don't have it rated, investors become, you know, they start asking a lot of questions. So, I mean, there's a lot of scope given the circumstances, and I think private and government need to work hand in hand to find solutions to how we can better manage liquidity, lower costs, and be more inclusive of asset managers or pension funds and all these other types of institutions. So there is scope, and I think together with financial institutions, we need to sit around the table and say, look, I mean, the cost of funding has shot out of the roof. How do we come out of this on the other side and help, you know, build this economy again?
Sorry, Hamilton, please continue.
So the problem is the problem. It's there, you know, like it's not going away. It's about how do we counter it? I mean, it's a matter of, you know, population versus resources, supply and demand. How do we ensure going forward things have to be different? How do we ensure that the capital out there is being shared equitably amongst all of us, and how are we influencing the decisions that have been made at, you know, at board levels as well?
Great, thank you. Miriam, the two questions that came in is, one, what about the social impact bond is Treasury finding most attractive in terms of what you're proposing? And secondly, will this help social entrepreneurs in any way?
I'm not sure I've ever seen the Q&A function, so now I see it and I can read the questions, which is great because I've got terrible internet connectivity. So the first thing that may also help in the answer of these questions is that what I should have said earlier as well is that right now we could head for economic collapse, by the way, and lose everything. We really could. When you have a funding gap of 200 billion or 300 billion actually, and we've clamped down on tax earning, which is actually how that stuff gets paid back at the end of the day, we actually could head for collapse. And I don't like being negative. I like being part of a solution, but that is the reality. So we're looking for big ideas. Frankly, a wage support proposal makes no sense either. You know, in standard economics, doing cheap loan bridging finance for anybody who's below a certain, you know, medium and small businesses in normal times makes no sense at all, right? If firms are going to fail, you don't offer, you know, blanket wage support across an economy. So a lot of this, we have to some extent, suspend our traditional ways of thinking about things so that we bridge across this period. Otherwise, we simply won't. So this COVID bond idea, I asked all these questions that your participants have asked and still ask them. The reality is, if we can't find a way of bridging that budget gap, I don't know what we're going to do. So we thought as a group, the COVID economist group, we have been trying to identify a small number of really high impact interventions that could help bridge us across to the other side is really the thing. And this bond idea, yes, it's a low return, but the capital is protected. Now, I don't know how many things are like that, other than, I guess, a government bond directly, which this essentially is. So this gives an alternative. And so I should have said that this becomes part of how we save the economy. That's what you're investing in. And you're directly investing in, you know, PE and wage support and whatever, and because one of the benefits to the investor who is feeling a little bit skeptical about government delivery is that this is targeted to certain things and has to be invested in a particular way. Otherwise, what government has to pay back is actually the 8% or whatever it would be at that time, right? So that is a benefit to the investor. I guess if government doesn't deliver, you get paid back. Hopefully, if government's still there, you get paid back a better rate of return than what you would have gotten on a bond, essentially. Otherwise, you're directly investing in securing the future of this country is actually what it is. It's at that scale of intervention that's what it is. Now, in terms of what Treasury finds attractive, well, that, what I've just said, it gives an alternative because this now is sort of ESG kind of investment for corporates. So it's not just, again, it's not just pension funds, although pension funds are the biggest show in town. But it gives them diversification, if I can say, and maybe less requirement. They probably will have to go to the IMF more than once, but it reduces the need to do that and gives a little bit more control over one's environment in low cost money raising. In terms of social entrepreneurship, you know, I guess it would, simply because there will be lots of opportunities in the area of what's invested in. But I don't know that that is the specific goal of the fund, which is a very poor answer, but I'm not sure what else to say.
Great, thanks, Miriam. Sibo, there's a question that came in about Nick's point about the recovery phase and that we need to build new models. And they ask if there's not an opportunity to direct a portion of the annual 9 billion Rand CSI money from corporates, let's say 10%, to annual contributions to an endowment or resilience fund to help with the Solidarity Fund's work. What is your views and thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think there is probably an opportunity to do that. But one thing that people need to probably understand from a CSI perspective or corporate foundations is that a lot of them are locked into programmatic funding, which is a 5-year period or what it is. And especially now during COVID-19, where companies are actually losing out on profits, there will be a much lower amounts of money that are available then. Maybe post COVID-19, and when growth happens and the industry grows, there is, I think, an opportunity to do that. But currently, because of the current economic climate and profits being suppressed, there will be a downturn in terms of how much foundations actually make. Secondly, I think that third point, there's an issue around, as I spoke about the legislation around, unless that trust or fund that they're contributing to is registered with SARS and there's a particular grading with SARS or particular legislation with SARS, there is limited movement from a foundation side on whether they could put money into that, which is where the problem is. They don't just look at, there's literally a stringent list that says you can do this, you can do this, you can do that. So unless the trust deed for that fund actually links to the list that is provided by SARS, you cannot put money in that unless you want to attract a tax penalty that is crazy. Yeah, so there is an opportunity, but for now, I think with the suppression of profits and the monies going into these foundations, there will be problems. And given the programmatic funding that they've already been, or they're already committed to, I think a lot of foundations have actually looked at the current partners who they're already funding currently, because they're also having problems in terms of raising funding or fundraising, because companies are not paying out a lot of grant funding. So those are the issues that then limit how you can actually spend or redirect money during this time.
Yeah, I think we're going to see a lot of change in spending behavior, change in decision making. I know in the private equity sector, they're thinking about their future investments, where they'll invest in, which industries, and asking more tougher questions during the due diligence process in terms of the kinds of companies that they'll invest in. Hamilton, I wanted to ask, in terms of information sharing and closing knowledge gaps within the private sector, how can the impact community address this in order to unlock more private capital to impact investing or to impact projects?
I mean, so currently what we try to do is we try to have this info packing sessions, which we host on a quarterly basis. But I think with COVID-19, there's a broader wish to do it more broadly across the country, across the continent. And I think we need to have more webinars, more Zoom discussions, to get the word out there and how banks or financial issues can actually impact those who are struggling at the moment. I mean, the channels are there. The channels are there. We just need to utilize them more. I mean, we've always utilized the channels, but only in confined spaces. But I think now is the time to reach out to the masses and get a sense and feel of how they're feeling on the ground as well. I mean, like, sitting where you're sitting, you'll never experience what the other person is experiencing as well. Like sitting in a bank, and when people come to you trying to access funding, and you give them all this list of due diligence, is different from when you're on the other side of the table. So, I mean, we have sessions, but I think we need to have more panels, more robust discussions on how we can obviously right the wrongs that have been and done in the past, which come into light with the issues that are happening right now, and set a platform for robust discussion and ideas to navigate through this current situation.
Thank you, Hamilton. Miriam, I'm going to ask you one final question. It's a question and a recommendation in one from one of our attendees. And then we'll go over to final comments from the panel and the closing comments. The question is it possible to get some concessionary capital or foundation money to act as a return enhancer on the social bond? If this can be done and potential return increases to repo plus 3%, it would make it more appealing to investors such as pension funds, and it might grab the attention of the asset consultants, etc. What are your thoughts on that?
It's not something we thought about. I think it's something that we should try on. It may be that some windows of the bond, I mean, I saw one of the questions was what sort of things would it be investing in? And of course that would have to be determined. I gave some examples, but that would still have to be determined. It may be that some of the windows would benefit from that. But remember that this goes through the channel of, the concept here is that it's a sovereign. And so it goes through the revenue fund. I don't know how people will feel about putting money directly. I don't even know if it's possible actually to put money into the revenue fund in that way. But it's a nice thought, and it's something that we should think about. I think in terms of raising the return on it, it may be that if one day we get to the point of getting a green light, that recommendation may come anyway of raising the return. I think the first thing is to find out if we could get away with this kind of approach, because then this is the lowest cost finance we'd be able to find, which is really what we have to do to shore up the fiscus. If we can do this, then we should try. I realize it's an imagination stretch, but everything we're doing, I mean, did Britain think they were going to be covering 80% of wages across the board? You have to think out of the box a lot in this period and try outlandish things.
Exactly. We need to think differently if we want to come back better, as Nick said. I'm going to ask for final comments from the panel. Sibo, if we can start with you. Any final comments around the discussion and the topic itself?
From my side, I think it's very encouraging to see the growth in impact investing sector in South Africa, especially now during the COVID-19. As I think Nick said, if we don't do anything now, then, you know, what are we there for as the impact investing kind of community? So, and we've seen quite a number of, when this started, a lot of the financial institutions and fund managers were very skeptical about it and the returns that come from impact investing. And now we're seeing an increased amount of people going in there, as well as foundations as well, have stayed clear and, you know, stayed in their grant funding corners. And we've seen them also increasingly coming in and working through the impact investing instruments that are available. So for me, it's quite encouraging. And I think COVID-19 is one of those areas where we should actually put in, as Miriam just said, thinking out of the box on how do we use all this capital from our side, the catalytic funders, how do we use this catalytic funding in order to unlock more money and also to basically make the risk return nexus palatable for your commercial funders as well, in order to crowd them into the space.
Great, thank you, Sibo. Hamilton, your final comments.
I think my final comments are twofold. First and foremost, as an organization, I just need to say that as ABSA Group, we are committed to doing whatever it takes to help in this current situation. And from a personal point of view, I mean, we have the channels, we've done social bonds, we've done green bonds, we're talking about impact bonds, and I think we have the resources, the channels, and the capabilities to leverage off to actually get together and think out of the box, you know, like, let's do something that's really going to move the dial. And I think we have the resources, we just need to start thinking differently. Thank you.
Thank you, Hamilton. And Miriam, final thoughts from your side?
Well, firstly, I just wanted to say it was very exciting to see that, you know, over 170 people were, you know, signed up for this event, and you know, that there's so much interest, and this has been a great engagement, and I thought the questions were absolutely spot on. What I would say is, you know, just thanks for the opportunity, and if I could just ask people who did join, if they could sign up on our website. It's all Tumamina stuff. I put the address for all the attendees, and if you sign up, then we'll just send you the you know, when the COVID social bond paper comes out, which should be soon, or anything else, we'll just send it to you automatically if you've subscribed there. So. You know, I hope that service is useful, and I hope this bond happens, and that you'll all be involved. Thanks.
Thank you, Miriam. And just as a reminder, it's COVID-19economicideas.org for those that might have missed it. Thank you so much to my panel. I really appreciate it. You've all been wonderful. I'd like to hand over to Sue now to close the session for us.
Thanks, Tanya. And thank you to all of the panelists. What a great discussion. What I'd like to do before we close is just bring to your attention a report that we've just completed on the use of smart capital for small and growing businesses. And we were specifically asked by the Shell Foundation to investigate a job-linked payment to incentivize job creation in small and growing businesses at scale in emerging markets. It is something that our team has designed and launched in the past year through the Green Outcomes Fund. We took a deep dive into a cohort of debt funds. We identified growth levers aligned with 4 areas of activity, those areas being the source of funding, construction of the portfolio, fund and investment management, and the business development side. We used the growth determinants to outline 4 debt fund archetypes, 2 of them supporting businesses in supply chains, small ticket asset based, and a venture debt fund. The list is not exhaustive, but it did help to test the smart capital principles around disbursement as a subsidy versus an incentive, for example, and based on financial or non-financial metrics. I think that ultimately our endeavor was to understand how to apply these principles that would either grow the number of businesses supported or the size of the businesses being financed. And then finally, we took a close look at 4 archetypal funds, being Inyosi Empowerment, Pagamani Impact Capital, Business Partners, and Growthin. And we concluded that although it's good to test variants of social outcome linked incentives, the size of the problem means that it would probably make more sense to distribute concessionary capital grant funding based on socioeconomic variables, and ultimately based on the growth and sustainability of the small and growing business or portfolio. Job growth being a byproduct of such businesses. But obviously the current situation, as Miriam and Hamilton and Sibo have outlined, is outside of our usual scope of reference. And we're actually in the process of applying this theory not to the emergency phase of response, but to the recovery phase, where we think that it will kick back into action. So watch this space. And in the interim, we will send you all a copy of the report in follow-up to this webinar. Just to close, I'd like to thank all of our speakers on behalf of the Impact Investing South Africa and the Bertha Center. I'd like to thank Nick for his cross-border insights into the opportunity presented by this crisis to build back better. To Tanya for her excellent moderating skills, and SAVCA's commitment, the members' commitment to supporting small businesses through the crisis. To Miriam for walking us through these radical policy options. They did seem radical a month ago, not so much anymore, but they are clearly absolutely necessary to keep our economy alive. Thank you to Hamilton for bringing his very pragmatic insights from the banking sector. I know ABSA has been at the forefront of these emergency efforts. And last but not least, to Sibo for demonstrating Tshikululu's pioneering role in bringing concessionary capital to bear in this market. And thanks to you all. Please watch out for our communication for the next webinar in this series. They are running as a precursor to what will now be the virtual GSG Summit on the original intended dates. That's the 9th, 10th of September this year. And we will circulate those details in due course. And thanks to everyone for joining. We want to encourage you in your own efforts to apply these investment strategies in your own sphere of influence. I'm looking at the participant list. There are many people there that are working tirelessly to ensure that we can achieve socioeconomic justice through using these tools and methods. So thank you very much.